What do the four horsemen have to do with what Jesus talks about in Matthew 24 as the beginning of the birth pains? Hey, I'm Randy Bond. I'm so glad that you're with us today. And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to take a look at the four horsemen as revealed in Revelation chapter 6. And then we're going to jump over to Matthew chapter 24, that passage that is often known as the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus lays out in great detail what's going to happen at the end of the age. I hope this will be a helpful study for you, and I'm so glad that you joined us today. Let's dig right in. Before we get to the four horsemen, let's get a little bit of the background. First off, these are the characters, the people, or the strange creatures that are seen at the opening of the first four seals in Revelation chapters 5 and 6, more specifically in chapter 6. The scroll that this all emerges from is revealed in Revelation chapter 5. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Then I saw in the right hand of him who was seated on the throne a scroll written within and on the back, sealed with seven seals." So this is a reference to God sitting on his throne, and he's holding a scroll. And this scroll is written on the front and on the back. And that's something that's very important because the writing on the front and back tells us that what is going to happen has already been determined in full. There's no room for any kind of additions. That God has already determined the events of the end already in detail, in full. The second is that it's sealed with seven seals. So this is a perfection of the sealing. It is perfectly sealed, and that informs us that what's written on the scroll cannot and will not be altered in any way. So what's anticipated to come out of the scroll is the events that are going to be happening at the end of the age. Verse 2 then records that John sees a mighty angel and hears him proclaim with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" Now, there's some silence as no one is found to be worthy. And John records that he began to weep and weep. But then verse 5, it says that one of the elders tells him, "Don't weep anymore. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its seven seals." Now, what's amazing in this is that when John turns to look, instead of seeing this mighty, victorious, fearsome lion, he sees a lamb that looks like it's been slain. This is an obvious reference of two different things about Jesus. One, he is the mighty king, but he is also the one who suffered for his people. And because of that suffering, he is the only one who is worthy and able to execute the events to come. So he goes and he takes the scroll, and then Revelation chapter 6 reveals what happens when Jesus begins to open these seals. So here's one of the key things, that everything that is about to happen in the book of Revelation and in the life to come here on earth is going to happen, it's going to come about because the Lamb, Jesus, sets it in motion. This is a critical piece of information from the book of Revelation. And by the way, if you have any questions along the way or you want to give some feedback, I hope that you'll leave a comment below. And if you don't mind, if this video is helpful for you in any way, insightful, help to kind of stimulate the thinking a little bit, I hope that you'll like and subscribe. We have a lot more videos that are coming on the book of Revelation, much like this. So again, thanks for watching, and let's dive in. So Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 through 8 is where we find the opening of the first four seals, and this is where we find the four horsemen being revealed. So let's dive in to Revelation. Verses 1 and 2. "Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say with a loud voice like thunder, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, 'Come.' And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine.' And when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And there were given him authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by a wild beast of the earth. So Revelation 6 is about to set in motion three sets of judgments throughout the book of Revelation. So the first of these judgments, the first set of seven, are the seven seals. That's found here in chapter 6. The first six are, but you have to jump over to chapter 8, verses 1 through 5 to catch the seven. There's an interlude in between in chapter 7. And then the second round of judgments is what's known as the seven trumpets. And this is found in the remainder of chapter 8 through chapter 9. And then again, there's another interlude, and then chapter 11 finishes that up. And then what we see finally is the seven bowls of wrath, or seven vials of wrath, depending on your translation, that comes out in chapters 15 and 16 in an uninterrupted way. So what we're talking about here is the first of these and the first four of these judgments, and that's the first four seals that reveals the coming of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they're known as. So as Jesus opens each of the seal, a new judgment is going to be executed on the earth. Revelation chapter 6, verse 8, and this is why I'm going to pull your attention here, because I use this word judgment intentionally. And we're going to look back at the Old Testament to see why. Verse 8 says, "And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and with wild beast of the earth." Notice these four things that they are given the authority to use as their instruments of death. So they're given this authority to kill a fourth of the world's population. And the instruments that they're given to do this is sword, famine, pestilence, wild beast. Now, park those in your mind, because this is going to be important. When we jump back to the book of Ezekiel, we're going to see this reference again. Now, there are no direct Old Testament quotations in the book of Revelation. It's kind of interesting, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, of allusions to the Old Testament. In fact, you cannot really truly understand the book of Revelation without a pretty good grasp of the Old Testament. They are so interwoven. It's incredible to see how much Revelation draws from a lot of the Old Testament imagery and language there, and not to mention the prophecies that are pulled from in the Old Testament that we see being fulfilled in the book of Revelation. Ezekiel chapter 5, we hear this pronouncement from the prophet Ezekiel to the people of God. He says, "You, Israel, Jerusalem in particular, will be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and a horror to the nations all around you, when I execute judgments on you in anger and fury, and with furious rebukes. I am the Lord, I am Yahweh, I have spoken." Now, if we drop down to verses 16 and 17 of the same chapter, and I would encourage you, read the whole chapter of Ezekiel chapter 5. This is what we hear continued in that prophecy. This is again the Lord speaking, "When I, the Lord, send against you the deadly arrows of famine, arrows for destruction, which I will send to destroy you. And when I bring more and more famine upon you and break your supply of bread, I will send famine and wild beast against you, and they will rob you of your children. Pestilence and blood shall pass through you, and I will bring the sword upon you. I am the Lord, I have spoken." Here's this emphasis yet again. Now, notice back again, Revelation chapter 6, verse 8, that fourfold judgment that we see that the four horsemen are bringing is sword, famine, pestilence, wild beasts. Look back at that Ezekiel 5, 16 and 17. Here it is, not the same order, but we have famine, wild beasts, pestilence, and sword. This is not a one-off. We see this again later in the book of Ezekiel. In Jeremiah, from chapter 4 to chapter 40, 14 times this fourfold judgment with these exact four things are spoken of there. This is very much a picture of the judgment of God that comes upon his people in the Old Testament and upon the world in the New Testament. And again, notice that the object of God's judgment here in Ezekiel 5 bouncing back to verse 5, it says, "Thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the center of the nations with countries all around her, and she has rebelled against my rules by doing wickedness more than the nations, and against my statutes more than the countries all around her, for they have rejected my rules and have not walked in my statutes." One of the things that I often hear when it comes to the study of end times, eschatology, when it comes to the book of Revelation, is indeed that passage of scripture that says that we are not appointed to wrath. This is not God's wrath. This is God's judgment. God's judgment has a redemptive element. When God brings judgment, he is firing the shots in order to get the attention of his people, or to get the attention of the people in general, the people of the world, in order to get them to turn back. There is a patience aspect in there, in that even though there are hardships and hard times that are coming, there's still this element that God is wanting the people to turn to him, that he is trying to communicate in very clear terms that he is serious about this, and that he really wants people to turn back to him. So let's now look a little more closely at the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they're typically called. So let's first dissect a little bit the events that are happening around the opening of the first four seals. So when the first four seals are opened, each of the four living creatures summons one of the riders. We meet the four living creatures in Revelation chapter 4. These are the angelic beings that are closest to the throne of God. They're the ones who lead out in worship. They're the ones who see God as he truly is. They have a place of great privilege and importance and responsibility and authority there. And these are the ones, as you see there in verse 1, when the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, I heard one of the four living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And so it's going to be the four living creatures in turn kind of moving around the throne that summon each of these four riders. Now, they're doing this at the authority of God. They're not doing this of their own initiative. This is because Jesus is setting these things in motion, and they are following that response to Jesus in order to bring that about. So they are just vehicles in order to announce it's coming. So it's like CO to XO, and the XO is announcing this and executing this command to the agents that will carry that out. You'll also notice that the color of the horses corresponds to the judgments that they deliver. So that's one of the interesting aspects of this. And this is not the first time that we see four riders on four horses of different colors. We encounter these again in the Old Testament in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 1, there's riders on four horses. They have different colors, and that's not the key thing. These are trying to communicate a very important message here. And then again in Zechariah chapter 6. So you can go back and look at that, but that gives us a little bit of a sense of sort of the role that the horsemen will play. They are agents of judgment. Each of the writers is given an object, and this object is related to their task. So they're given a crown, they're given a sword, they're given scales, and in the fourth one, Hades is kind of thrown into the mix there as that one's object, and that's the fourth writer is death. So the grave is kind of the instrument that is being kind of metaphorically spoken of there. So who or what are these four riders? These are very interesting people or creatures that are coming on the scene. We'll talk about them in order, but we're going to skip the first one for right now. The last three, numbers 2, 3, and 4, are pretty straightforward, but the first one has kind of been an object of controversy, so or discussion at least. So we'll come back to that one. The second rider is on the bright red horse. And this one brings war and violence, maybe violence in that general sense. So the picture is that you see an uptick of international conflicts, civil wars, and just violence in general. Not just coming out of war, but in the sense of, as Scripture says, the love of most will grow cold, that there is a lot of danger. Society is decaying, it's falling apart, and it's not really safe to go out. That you run the risk of bodily harm by just simply being outdoors. So think kind of Mad Max, so some of those post-apocalyptic kind of films that you see, where it's really dangerous. to be alone or unarmed or not tough, as you kind of see in the movies. This is sort of the picture where you see society becoming highly violent, and a lot of wars are taking place both externally, internationally, and perhaps internally as well. The writer is taking peace from the earth. The third writer comes with scales, and this is kind of that indication of famine and scarcity. So famine can arise out of just the nature of international conflict, that there are disruptions. I mean, you can think right now of the war in Ukraine. Ukraine is the breadbasket for Europe. Now, when I record this right now, I am sitting about an 11-hour drive from the Ukrainian border, and I have seen the impact of what that disruption has been making on the European nations, with the natural resources like natural gas coming into the Western Europe. And certainly with the food supply. Ukraine is a very fertile area, but because of the war, the farming operations have been all but shut down. And so when you think of that in a more of a global scale, or a much larger scale, this is where you see the shelves becoming empty in the store. I remember, COVID here was, other disruptions, but those were, again, related to government policies, and that could be a factor in this. And not just weather. Weather could be a factor in this as well. But I remember going into one store, and there was no meat in there except for those vegan fake meats. And even in a time of scarcity, nobody wanted to buy those. So, whatever that's worth. Sorry if you're a vegan or vegetarian. That was just the reality. And so this is kind of what we see happening, that it could either be because of weather, because of politics, or war. Any of those could bring this about. And you find that what they talk about is that it's basically a day's wage. A denarius was a day's wage back in the time that you would need in order to buy enough wheat, or the poor man's grain, barley, in order to feed your family for a day on a very meager meal. Now, interestingly, the oil and the wine are not allowed to be harmed. Now, these are the deeper rooted kind of things. I'm in the vineyards right now, and you can see that these are deep rooted things that a short-term drought would not have any impact on. Same way with the olive trees, they're very drought hardy. And so these things could withstand short term. So that might be part of what's being indicated here, that this is in part, at the very least, weather related in what's going to happen. Nonetheless, we find hyperinflation. That this is going to be very costly because of scarcity or high prices, or both. That it will be very difficult to buy food during this time. There will be a lot of starving people, a lot of hungry people. And if we're alive at that time, we could be among them. It'll be a difficult time. And then coming out of that is death. Kind of a logical sequence here, that we have conquest and war and violence and famine. All of those kind of flow in a logical sort of sequence. And obviously related to that, and these are all interrelated, is death. This is the writer on the pale or sickly green horse. The Greek word to describe pale or green, depending on your translation, is the word chloros. That's the Greek word that we use now for chlorine. Chlorine is a green gas. And unfortunately, as a pastor, I've been around people when they have passed away, when they've died, and around families getting ready for funerals, and I've seen that color, and it's a stomach turning color. And this is how this writer is described. He's not attractive. He's fear inducing. And certainly his task is that indeed. So these come in, and again, understand, these will not necessarily be visible in the sky. You should not expect to look up and see a horse riding across the sky or across the land. These are the things that are happening in the background, that the spiritual realm is what is initiating what will happen in our physical realm. So I would not expect to see these riders, but these are the agents that are being used by God in the spiritual realm to create these events that are going on. We'll talk more about when the riders will ride in just a minute. But let's go back to that first rider, the rider on the white horse. And this is, again, has been the subject of a lot of conversation about who this is. And so that question is, who or what is that first rider? And no, it's not Gandalf. I know this, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, that it looks kind of like that, but this is not one of the options there. So some of the options that we see is number one, Jesus. Number two is that it's just kind of this general spirit of warfare and conquest. So just kind of, you see nations going crazy and an outbreak of wars all at once. And that's a legitimate viewpoint there for sure. And then third is that this is the Antichrist. And here is kind of why we see this. And so we're going to mark out the second one here, and we're going to compare the first and second, because there is another rider on a white horse mentioned in Revelation chapter 19. So here in chapter 6, verse 2, we see a rider on a white horse. This rider has a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. In Revelation chapter 19, here's the description of that rider on that white horse. It says, "Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems. And he has a name written that no one knows but himself. From his mouth comes a sharp sword." So the question is, is this one and the same? Both ride on a white horse. Both have weapons. In chapter 6, the rider has a bow. Chapter 19, it's a sword. And both have crowns. However, that's the translation in English. It's actually different words in the Greek. And this is where we begin to see that we may not be talking about the same writer, because the one in chapter 6 is a Stephanos. It's a victor's crown. It's that laurel that one would wear to show that they have been victorious, or they are the victor. And in chapter 19, it's a diadem. This is a royal crown. This is the crown of royalty and true authority. So there may be a difference because of that. And both are riding out to conquer. So again, going back to the comparison of the two, in chapter 19, it is very clearly Jesus. He is faithful and true. This has been his title throughout the book of Revelation. These are descriptions that we see from chapter 1 and verse 12 here in chapter 19, chapter 19, verse 12. These are the same kind of descriptions that we see back in chapter 1. This is clearly Jesus here, but is it Jesus in Revelation chapter 6? And again, no. And a lot of people, and myself included, think that this may be the Antichrist. Now, I put an asterisk by this because I don't know that this is actually it. Now, I would also say that the Antichrist interpretation is "thus thinketh the Randy," and others along with me. It's not necessarily "thus saith the Lord." So this is more in the line of speculation, not clear revelation. And when we are coming to the book of Revelation, revelation should always, what is revealed clearly, takes precedence over speculation. We tend to speculate when there's gaps, when there's blanks, when we are trying to figure out what exactly this is. And we need to always, always, always choose what is clear over what is unclear. And so I hold this tentatively, but I think it's a decent. It has some good founding for that, but it's not necessarily something that you should take to the bank and say, this is absolutely the Antichrist here. But when we compare this to Matthew chapter 24, I think you'll see a little bit more why I think this might be the Antichrist that's talked about here. So let's go ahead and jump over and compare the seven seals to Matthew chapter 24. This might be something new for you, and I hope that it's helpful for you, and I hope that maybe you take something away from that. As we're jumping in, here's a couple of important things to remind you of, and always to remember. Number one, Jesus never, ever contradicts himself. Jesus is the one who is speaking in Matthew chapter 24. If you go to Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, you see that it is Jesus who is revealing this to John. And so Revelation is no less the words of Jesus than Matthew chapter 24. This is an important thing to highlight, is that we're not talking about the opinion of Jesus versus John. We are talking about what Jesus has said in Matthew 24 and what Jesus has said in the entire book of Revelation. The second thing, and this is a little bit of what we've alluded to just now, is that obscure passages, things that are not clear, should always be interpreted in light of the clear ones. And I think Matthew 24 is a good place to go to, because this is where Jesus speaks very clearly about the events that are going to happen. And I think that he speaks about them in a very clear, logical, and chronological order. And that's going to be helpful for us as we're interpreting the entire book of Revelation, but particularly the seven seals. So let's get a basic outline of the events in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 4. So background on this, remember, the disciples have been walking by the temple. They've been admiring the great big stones, and they're commenting on that. And Jesus interrupts and says, I tell you the truth, not one of those is going to be left standing on the other. And, this caused a little bit of stir and controversy among the disciples. So they ask him, well, what's going to be the signs of your coming, and what's going to happen at the end? And this is how Jesus begins to answer them. So starting in verse 4 is his answer to the big questions that they have. And Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Here's that key phrase that I mentioned at the very beginning. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. So the actual full events are going to happen later. Everything that he's been referring to up until now is just kind of those Braxton Hicks labor pains, those beginning points of labor pains. So here's kind of the outline that we see. So just quick summary bullet points of what we see in the beginning of the birth pains. Number one, part of the beginning of the birth pains is the coming of the false Christ. Second is the hearing of wars and rumors of wars. Third, verse 7, you see we're just going verse by verse here. Verse 7 is famines. A second part of verse 7, we see in the King James pestilences. Now, pestilence is plagues and epidemics, pandemics, a word that we're all too familiar with now. And this may be a carryover into the Greek manuscripts that the King James Version used, but this is clearly in Luke chapter 21, which is the other place that records this. And there's also Mark, I think, chapter 20, where Jesus talks about this discussion right here. So these are the three parallel passages in the Gospels. So in Luke 21, this pestilences is added in there, just like we see right there in the King James. Also in the beginning of the birth pains, here's that verse again. But right after that, we see tribulation, and he talks about great tribulation. Now, we'll talk more about that in the next video. So I'll leave a link for that so you can watch that if you're interested. And then we see in verse 29, these cosmic disturbances, sun and moon and all these kind of events that are happening. And then verse 30, he reveals the coming of the Son of Man and the gathering of the elect. So let's do a little parallel, putting the first four. Well, we'll go ahead and go through all 7 of these, and we'll show you the parallels to Matthew chapter 24. And it's very interesting to look at. So in the first seal, we see, and again, this is the speculative thing, that this may be the Antichrist. But Matthew 24, the first thing that he talks about is the coming of the false Christ, these Antichrist type personalities that will be coming. Seal 2, we see that peace is taken from the earth. This is the rider on the red horse. And you hear in Matthew 24 of the wars and rumors of wars. So this is kind of the paralleling of these two, the nations rising against each other and the kingdoms rising against other kingdoms. Seal number 3, we see Matthew chapter 24, the talk of famines. And in the seals, the third seal is the rider on the black horse. And that's where the wheat is a denarius, a quart of wheat or liter, if you keep track that way. And a liter or 3 liters or 3 quarts of barley is also denarius. In the fourth seal, we see famines and pestilence. And again, look over here at Matthew 24. famines, and pestilence. Now, I'm using the King James here. Most of what I'm using is ESV, but you could go to Luke chapter, I've got a typo there. It's actually chapter 21, not chapter 17. Luke 17:11 or 21:11 is where you can actually see that there. And just really quickly, and this is what our next video is going to talk about, the comparison of the fifth seal, the martyrs under the throne. And then the fifth seal, when that's open, John is able to see the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. In Matthew chapter 24, this is where he begins to talk about the Great Tribulation. He says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Again, that's covered in more detail in the next video. Seal number 6, we see the sun becoming black as sackcloth. And here we see in verse 29, the sun will be darkened. Here's some of those cosmic disturbances. We see the moon becoming like blood. In Matthew 24, it says the moon will not give its light. We see in the sixth seal, the stars of the sky fell to earth. We see in Matthew 24:29, the stars will fall from heaven. And so here is just this incredible parallel between Matthew 24 and the six seals in Revelation 6. I don't think it's accidental. I mean, the same Jesus who's revealing this in Matthew chapter 24 is also the one who's revealing this in the entire book of Revelation, including chapter 6. And so I think that Revelation chapter 6 is kind of an overarching timeline of the events that are going to happen throughout the book of Revelation. And this kind of gives us those broad bullet points, and everything else is going to fall out of that, just like it does in Matthew chapter 24. So then one of the questions that's often asked is when will or when do or when did the horsemen ride? And so there is one idea that gets floated out there is that they've already begun to ride, and they began to ride at the exaltation of Jesus. And I can understand how some people could draw that conclusion, but there are a lot of questions that I have with that. Part of what we see in the beginning of the birth pains is the wars and rumors of wars and famines and people dying from violence and those kind of things. All of that happened before Jesus came, before the incarnation. That's not been a new thing that's happened since Jesus ascended into heaven. That's not a new thing. The second reason why I think that this is still a future event, and not even having happened recently, and this is where some people tend to go in some of the YouTube videos and discussion today, is that they think that's the Four Horsemen already began to ride in the 20th century or something to that effect. But here's why I think it is still future to us now. And this, I'm going to go back to scripture to prove this. And that's Revelation chapter 6, verse 8 again. This is the rider on the pale green horse. His name is Death, and Hades followed him. Notice here in the bold, in the larger print, and they were given the authority over a fourth of the earth to kill, with the sword, with famine, with pestilence, and wild beast of the earth. So has there been a time on earth since Jesus, and this is an important thing because Revelation is written after Jesus, so either in the 60s AD or the 90s AD, I tend to go toward the later date. Since that date, has there been a time where 25% of the world's population has died? I can't think of anything. The closest thing that I can think of is maybe the Dark Ages, when we had the plagues that went through in the 6th century. There was an incredible, horrid year when there was some kind of volcanic eruption or something, and that led to a decade of famine and basically launched into the Dark Ages. That was in the year 5. It was around the middle of the 6th century, in the 500s. But since that time, even in the 20th century, which has been incredibly violent and deadly, we think about World War II, where 75 million people were killed, either as combatants or civilians. Think about World War I, where another 20 million were killed because of war. And on top of that, 20 million were killed at the same time because of the global pandemic of the Spanish flu. So, I mean, right there between those two, we're looking at 115 million. And if you consider that at that time, the world population was about 1.5 billion people, we're nowhere near 25%. If that were to happen today, the world's population is a little around 8 billion people. We would be looking at the deaths of 2 billion people. Two is 1/4 of 8. And so we would see a population reduction from 8 billion to 6 billion. And to my knowledge, there has not been a time in human history since the time of Jesus where we have had a decrease of population by 1/4, with the exception of maybe the Dark Ages, but I don't hear anyone arguing for the Four Horsemen coming during that time frame. So I think it's still a future event, and I think it will begin at the start of Daniel's 70th week. Now, that's a reference back to Daniel chapter 9, and this speaks very much into the book of Revelation and even into what Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 24. This is that final week of years, that 7-year period. And so my understanding is that this takes place at the beginning of that 7-year time frame. I believe that Christians will be here during that time. I don't see any evidence or reason to think otherwise. So it'll be a very difficult time on planet Earth for both believers and non-believers. Well, what can we take away from all this? So here's just some theological takeaways from Revelation chapter 6. Number one, there is coming a day when God turns up the heat on the people of planet Earth. That's what is beginning to happen. In Revelation 6, we see God trying to get the attention of the people of planet Earth through these judgments in order to call them back to himself, to make them realize that he is real, he is serious, and that they need to turn to him. And again, his judgments are intended in part to demonstrate powerfully the seriousness and severity of his wrath to come. There is very much a redemptive element in what God is going to do. And sadly, as we see even in the second round of judgments, and this is Revelation chapter 9, that even when God turns up the heat more, people will still have a hardened heart toward him. Verse 20 of Revelation 9 says that the rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, nor give up worshiping demons and idols. That's a tragic statement. Here's God making it very, very clear that sin is serious. They are in serious trouble, and he is letting them know in tangible ways that he's real and that he's serious. And you see throughout, people begin to understand this is God doing this. So when you, spoiler alert, when you read more of Revelation, you see people coming to understand God is God, God is doing this, and they're still not turning to him. And so in this, in the judgments that are coming, God has taken away any excuse. People cannot say who lived during that time frame, I didn't know. And that's going to be a powerful demonstration and powerful evidence against them whenever they stand before God in judgment. And one of the other things that we see is that God is fully sovereign. Even things intended for destruction like death and the Antichrist are only tools in his hands to accomplish his perfect end. We see, again, going back to what I said at the very beginning, everything that's going to happen happens because the Lamb sets it in motion, and that includes the Antichrist coming. And the fourth rider that we see coming is death. But in Revelation chapter 20, we see death and Hades destroyed, cast into the lake of fire. And we also see in Revelation chapter 20 or 19 that the Antichrist is cast into the lake of fire. These are only tools in his hands. And that means that God is absolutely in control, and we can trust him that no matter what is happening, no matter how bad it may get, God still got this. No matter how crazy government may seem to get, and it's getting crazy, God's still in control. God is still on his throne, and God is the one who is orchestrating everything that is going to come about in his way and in his time. And that's a sense of comfort and peace, even knowing days may get darker before they get better. Hey, thanks for watching. I'm so glad that you took the time today. It really means a lot. I'm honored that you did. If this really helped you in any way, I hope that you'll like the video. That really helps YouTube to push that out to others. So if you think this was helpful and might be helpful to someone else, a like will go a long way in doing that. Share it if you want to. And please leave a comment. Love to hear your questions. Love to hear your feedback on this. Tell me I'm crazy. That's okay. Tell me you're crazy. That's okay too. But I'm so glad that you came today, and I hope that you'll watch some more of our other videos. Thanks again. God bless. We'll see you next time.